The rushing water roared like an angry beast as Katherine Lee stood frozen on the riverbank, watching helplessly as the current carried away her only means of crossing. The year was 1878, and the usually placid Madison River that cut through Montana territory had transformed overnight into a raging torrent after 3 days of unrelenting spring rains. Katherine clutched her sodden shawl tighter around her shoulders, her heart pounding as the makeshift bridge she'd been about to cross disappeared beneath the churning waters. "Lord Almighty," she whispered, backing away as the muddy bank beneath her boots began to crumble. The water was rising faster than she'd anticipated, already lapping at her ankles then her calves. She turned to flee, but the sudden rush of water knocked her off balance. Katherine stumbled, her skirts immediately soaking up the river water like a thirsty sponge, weighing her down as she struggled to find her footing. "Help," she cried out, though she knew it was futile. Her small homestead was miles behind her, and the trading post where she'd been headed was still a good hour's ride away if she'd still had her horse. The poor creature had gone lame 2 days prior, leaving Katherine to make the journey on foot. Now that decision might cost her life. The water rose to her knees with frightening speed, and Katherine felt the powerful current trying to sweep her legs out from under her. She clawed desperately at the muddy bank, but her fingers found only more mud and loose rocks that gave way under her grasp. The roar of hooves cut through the sound of rushing water, so unexpected that Katherine thought she might be imagining it. She turned her head, squinting through the rain, and spotted a rider approaching at breakneck speed. The man sat tall and straight in his saddle, his dark duster flapping behind him like wings as he urged his horse toward the river's edge. "Hold on." The deep voice carried over the water's roar as the rider drew his horse to a sharp halt at the edge of the rising water. Katherine could only see him in glimpses through her rain-soaked vision, a tall figure with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. "Grab my hand." The stranger extended his arm, leaning dangerously from his saddle. Katherine stretched toward him, but the distance was too great. The water now swirled around her waist, and she could feel her feet sliding in the mud. Without hesitation, the rider spurred his horse into the shallows. The animal snorted in protest but obeyed, stepping carefully into the rushing current. In one fluid motion, the man leaned down and wrapped a strong arm around Katherine's waist. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady despite the danger. With a strength that took her breath away, he lifted her from the water and swung her up across his saddle. Katherine gasped, finding herself suddenly pressed against the solid warmth of the stranger as he turned his horse back toward dry ground. "The river's rising too fast," he shouted over the storm. "We need higher ground and quick." Katherine barely had time to nod before the man had settled her more securely in front of him. One strong arm wrapped around her waist as he guided the horse away from the swollen river. The animal responded instantly to its master's commands, surging forward with powerful strides that carried them swiftly across the muddy terrain. Through the driving rain, Katherine caught glimpses of her rescuer's face, strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble, straight nose, and eyes the color of a summer sky. He handled the reins with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent his life on horseback, a true son of the frontier. "My name's Kieran Westley," he said, his mouth close to her ear so she could hear him over the storm. "Hang on tight, miss. We've got a ways to ride before we're safe." "Katherine Lee," she managed to reply, her teeth chattering from cold and shock. "Thank you for saving me." A ghost of a smile crossed his weather-beaten face. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Lee. We're not out of danger." The river had begun to spill over its banks behind them, water rushing across the valley floor with frightening speed. Kieran spurred his horse toward the foothills that rose in the distance, the only hope of sanctuary from the rapidly rising waters. Katherine clutched the saddle horn, acutely aware of the stranger's arm around her waist, improper under any other circumstances. But at the moment, that strong grip was all that kept her from sliding off the horse into the muddy chaos below. She'd never ridden like this before, pressed against a man's chest with his breath warm against her rain-soaked hair. "There's a ridge ahead," Kieran shouted, pointing with his free hand toward a line of trees about half a mile distant. My cabin's just beyond, we'll be safe there. Katherine nodded, unable to form words as exhaustion and cold seeped into her bones. The horse beneath them labored through the increasingly muddy ground, its powerful muscles straining with each step. Behind them, the river continued its relentless advance, swallowing everything in its path. Come on, Thunder, Kieran urged his mount. Just a bit further, boy. The stallion seemed to understand the urgency in his master's voice, finding new reserves of strength as they approached the tree line. The ground began to slope upward, offering blessed relief from the pursuing floodwaters. Katherine felt Kieran's arm tighten around her as they entered the forest, the thick canopy providing some shelter from the driving rain. Almost there, he promised, and Katherine found herself trusting this stranger implicitly, though she'd known him less than an hour. The trees thinned, revealing a small clearing where a sturdy log cabin stood. Smoke still curled from the stone chimney, suggesting Kieran had left recently, perhaps when he'd first noticed the rising waters. He guided his horse to the covered porch and dismounted in one fluid motion before reaching up to help Katherine down. Her legs buckled the moment they touched the ground, the shock and exertion finally catching up with her. Kieran caught her easily, sweeping her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Easy now, he murmured, carrying her through the cabin door which he pushed open with his boot. Let's get you warm. The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A small table with two chairs sat in what served as a kitchen, and a narrow bed was tucked into the corner. Kieran set Katherine gently on a chair near the fire before moving to stoke the embers back to life. You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death, he said matter-of-factly, though Katherine noticed he kept his eyes averted as he spoke. I have some spare clothes you can wear. They'll be too big, but they're dry. Katherine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly conscious of how her sodden dress clung to her form. Thank you, Mr. Westley. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. Kieran's expression darkened as he added another log to the growing fire. I've seen the Madison take lives before. This isn't the first spring flood, and it won't be the last. He straightened up and moved to a trunk at the foot of his bed, retrieving a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers. These should do. I'll tend to Thunder while you change. He placed the clothes on the table beside her and stepped outside without another word, closing the door firmly behind him. Katherine stared after him for a moment before the chill of her wet garments spurred her into action. Her fingers fumbled with the tiny buttons of her dress, stiff with cold and trembling from exhaustion. Finally, she managed to free herself from the sodden garment, hanging it near the fire to dry before quickly donning the offered clothing. The shirt smelled of pine and leather and something uniquely masculine that she assumed was Kieran's own scent. The trousers were comically large, but she rolled up the legs and tightened the belt as much as possible. The result was hardly fashionable, but at least she was warm and dry. A knock at the door announced Kieran's return. Are you decent, Miss Lee? Yes, thank you, she called back, smoothing her hands nervously over the borrowed shirt. When he re-entered, carrying an armload of firewood, his eyes widened slightly at the sight of her in his clothes before he quickly composed his features. I've put Thunder in the lean-to. He'll be fine there until the storm passes. Katherine nodded, suddenly shy in the presence of this man who'd saved her life. Mr. Westley, I can't thank you enough. Kieran set the wood down beside the hearth and straightened, removing his hat to reveal thick brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. Without the hat shadowing his features, Katherine could see his face clearly, for the first time handsome in a rugged way, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than his current serious expression indicated. You can thank me by telling me what you were doing out in this weather all alone, he said, hanging his wet coat on a peg by the door. These parts aren't safe for a woman traveling by herself, even without the flood. Katherine sank back into the chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. I was trying to reach Cooperville before nightfall. My horse went lame 2 days ago and I needed supplies. Cooperville? Kieran frowned. That's 15 miles from here. I know, Katherine admitted. But my provisions won't last another week and I needed to make the journey. Kieran regarded her with newfound interest. You live alone, Katherine lifted her chin, defensive despite her precarious situation. I have a small homestead about 10 miles south of here. My father staked the claim 3 years ago, but he passed last winter, pneumonia. Understanding dawned in Kieran's eyes. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Lee, but surely you have family who could help, someone who could take you in. No one, Katherine replied simply. My mother died when I was young. My father brought me west from Boston after she passed. We were all each other had. She stared into the flames, remembering her father's final days. The land is mine now, all I have left of him. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the persistent drumming of rain on the cabin roof. After a moment, Kieran moved to the small stove in the corner and set a pot of water to boil. You must be hungry, he said, his tone gentler than before. I don't have much, but there's some venison stew I can heat up. Katherine's stomach growled at the mention of food, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since early morning. That would be wonderful, thank you. As Kieran busied himself preparing the meal, Katherine took the opportunity to study him more closely. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to fending for himself, his hands deft and sure as he worked. She guessed him to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most, though life in the territories aged a person quickly. Have you lived here long, Mr. Westley? She asked, breaking the silence. Going on 5 years now, he replied without looking up from his work. Came out from Pennsylvania after the war, needed open spaces after seeing what men could do to each other. The war. Katherine didn't need to ask which one. The conflict between North and South had ended 13 years ago, but its shadows still stretched long across the nation. She wondered which side he'd fought for but decided not to ask. Out here in the territories, old allegiances mattered less than a man's character and abilities. You fought, she asked instead. Kieran nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. Enlisted at 17, saw things no boy should see. He glanced up, meeting her gaze. But that's all behind me now. Out here, a man can make his own way, be judged by what he does rather than where he came from. Katherine understood that sentiment all too well. Her father had sought the same fresh start when he brought her west. Is that why you became a cowboy? A genuine smile broke across Kieran's face, transforming his features. What makes you think I'm a cowboy, Miss Lee? Heat crept into Katherine's cheeks. Well, the way you ride, for one thing, and you certainly look the part. Kieran chuckled, a rich, warm sound that seemed to fill the small cabin. I work for the Circle M Ranch, driving cattle and breaking horses mostly, but I'm not much for the bunkhouse life, so Mr. Montgomery lets me stay out here in exchange for keeping an eye on this section of his property. It sounds lonely, Katherine observed, then immediately regretted her words. I'm sorry, that was impertinent of me. No need to apologize for speaking the truth, Kieran replied, ladling the now steaming stew into 2 wooden bowls. It can be lonely. But I've got thunder for company, and the mountains don't ask uncomfortable questions. He handed her a bowl and spoon. What about you, Miss Lee? Isn't it lonely managing a homestead by yourself? Katherine accepted the food gratefully, savoring the rich aroma that made her mouth water. Sometimes, she admitted, but I keep busy. There's always work to be done, crops to tend, chickens to feed, repairs to make. I don't have much time to dwell on being alone. Kieran settled into the chair opposite her with his own bowl. A woman alone on a homestead that takes courage, Miss Lee. Or foolishness, Katherine replied with a small smile. My neighbors think I'm mad for not selling up and heading back east after Father died. And why didn't you? Kieran asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Katherine took a spoonful of stew, considering her answer. The land is good. Father chose well when he staked our claim. The soil's rich, there's water nearby at least when it's not trying to drown everything, and we put too much work into it to abandon it now. She met his gaze steadily. Besides, what would I go back to, a life as someone's governess? A spinster relative living on charity, Out here I may struggle, but at least I'm my own woman." Kieran studied her with new respect. "Your father must have been proud of you." "I hope so," Katherine said softly, turning her attention back to her meal. They ate in companionable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. The rain showed no signs of abating, the downpour occasionally punctuated by distant rumbles of thunder. Katherine found herself grateful for the solid walls of the cabin and the steady presence of the man across from her. "The river will be impassable for days," Kieran said at last, setting aside his empty bowl. "The last time we had rains like this, the valley flooded for nearly a week." Katherine's heart sank. "A week, but my animals, my chickens, my cow, they need tending." "Your place is 10 miles south, you said." Kieran frowned, clearly calculating something in his mind. "Does it sit high or low?" "On a rise," Katherine replied. "Father was careful about that." "The cabin should be safe from flooding, but I'm worried about my livestock." Kieran nodded. "Smart man, your father. If your place is on high ground, your animals will likely be fine for a few days, especially if you left them feed. Chickens are hardy creatures." "And what about me?" Katherine asked, voicing the concern that had been growing since the realization that she was effectively stranded. "I can't impose on your hospitality for days." A flush crept up Kieran's neck, and he suddenly seemed very interested in the fire. "You're not imposing, Miss Lee." "I can hardly turn you out in this weather." He cleared his throat. "I'll sleep on the floor, of course. You can have the bed." Katherine felt her own cheeks warm at the implication. Propriety dictated that an unmarried woman should never stay alone with an unmarried man, but these were hardly normal circumstances. Still, if anyone from town learned of this arrangement, her reputation would be in tatters. "I appreciate your chivalry, Mr. Westley," she said carefully. "But perhaps when the rain lets up a bit, you could escort me to town. Surely Mrs. Holloway at the boarding house would take me in until it's safe to return home." Kieran rose and moved to the window, pushing aside the rough burlap curtain to peer out at the deluge. "We can try in the morning if the rain eases, but I wouldn't count on it. The path to town crosses lower ground than we're on now. It'll be underwater by morning." Katherine felt a flutter of panic. "So we're truly trapped here?" Kieran turned to face her, his expression serious but kind. "Not trapped, Miss Lee, safe. Remember that not 6 hours ago you were nearly swept away by the river. Here you have shelter, food, and dry clothes." A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "And while I may not be the most refined company, I promise you'll come to no harm while under my roof." There was such sincerity in his voice that Katherine found herself believing him implicitly. This man had already risked his life to save hers. He clearly wasn't the sort to take advantage of a vulnerable woman. "I'm sure you're right," she conceded, stifling a yawn. The events of the day were catching up with her, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. Kieran noticed immediately. "You should rest." "Take the bed, I insist," he added when she began to protest. "I'll make up a pallet by the fire." Too tired to argue further, Katherine nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Westley, for everything." "Kieran," he said, surprising her. "If we're going to be sharing quarters, even temporarily, I think you can call me Kieran." Katherine smiled, oddly touched by the simple offer. "Then you must call me Katherine." Something warm flickered in Kieran's blue eyes. "Katherine," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name on his tongue. "Rest well. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." As Katherine settled onto the narrow bed, pulling the rough woolen blanket up to her chin, she found herself thinking that for the first time since her father's death, she wasn't facing an uncertain future entirely alone. The thought brought unexpected comfort as she drifted into an exhausted sleep, lulled by the sound of rain on the roof and the quiet movements of the cowboy tending the fire. Katherine woke to the persistent patter of rain against the cabin's roof, though the ferocity of the previous day's downpour had somewhat diminished. Gray morning light filtered through the small window, casting the interior in muted shadows. For a moment, disorientation gripped her: the unfamiliar bed, the rough-hewn walls, the scent of coffee and wood smoke hanging in the air. Then memory rushed back: the river, the rescue, the cowboy who had saved her life. Speaking of whom, Katherine pushed herself up on her elbows to find Kieran already awake and moving about the cabin with quiet efficiency. He had his back to her as he tended something on the stove, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. His hair was damp, suggesting he'd already been outside despite the continuing rain. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. Kieran turned, a brief smile lighting his features when he saw her. "Morning, wasn't sure when you'd wake." "Figured you needed the rest after yesterday's ordeal." Katherine swung her legs over the edge of the bed, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance in his borrowed clothes. She ran a hand through her tangled hair, wishing for a brush and proper attire. "What time is it?" "Just past 8, Kieran replied, pouring dark coffee into a tin cup. "Later than I usually rise, but I spent some time checking the surroundings." He handed her the steaming cup. "The news isn't good, I'm afraid." Katherine accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm metal. "The flooding," Kieran nodded, leaning against the table with his own cup. "Worse than I expected. The valley's underwater as far as I can see from the ridge. The path to town is completely submerged and the river's still rising." He took a sip of his coffee, eyes meeting hers over the rim. "I'm afraid we're going to be neighbors for a few days at least." The news shouldn't have surprised her, but Katherine felt her stomach tighten nonetheless. Not from fear of Kieran, he'd proven himself honorable, but from concern about her homestead and the impropriety of their situation. "I see," she said quietly, staring into her coffee. "And there's no way to reach my property either, I assume?" "Not without swimming, and I wouldn't recommend that," Kieran confirmed. "But try not to worry too much. If your place is on high ground as you said, it should weather the flood. And I've got enough provisions to see us through until the waters recede." Katherine nodded, taking a careful sip of the strong coffee. "Thank you. I'll find a way to repay your kindness when this is all over." "No need," Kieran said, waving away her gratitude. "Any decent man would have done the same." "Perhaps," Katherine replied, "but I'm not sure any man would have reached me in time. You must know these lands well to have spotted me from a distance." A shadow seemed to cross Kieran's face. "I was tracking the river's rise. After the last big flood took the Johnsons and their 2 little ones 3 springs ago, some of us keep a close eye when the rains come heavy." He set his cup down with a definitive click. "But that's enough grim talk. Are you hungry? I've got flapjacks on the stove." The simple domestic scene that followed sharing breakfast at Kieran's small table, the rain drumming steadily on the roof, felt strangely comfortable to Katherine. In the weeks following her father's death, meals had been lonely, silent affairs. Now, sitting across from this quiet cowboy, she found herself relaxing despite the precariousness of her situation. "You mentioned you came from Boston originally," Kieran asked as they ate. "That's quite a journey for a young woman." Katherine nodded, grateful for the conversation. "I was only 16 when Father decided to head west. Mother had been gone 3 years by then, and there was nothing keeping us in Boston except memories." She smiled faintly, remembering. "I was terrified at first. Everything I knew was back east, my friends, my education, the life I'd been raised to expect." "And now," Kieran prompted, his blue eyes intent on her face. "Now I can't imagine living anywhere else," Katherine admitted. "The mountains, the open spaces, even with all the hardships, there's a freedom here I never found in the city." Kieran nodded in understanding. "It gets in your blood. I felt the same way first time I rode across open prairie after the war, like I could finally breathe again after years of choking." There was something in his tone that spoke of deeper wounds than he was letting on, but Katherine didn't press. Everyone who came west carried their burdens. It was an unspoken rule of the frontier not to pry too deeply into another's past. "What about family?" she asked instead. "Do you have anyone back east?" "A sister in Philadelphia," Kieran replied. "Married with 3 little ones now, we write, but—" He shrugged. "She doesn't understand why I chose this life instead of coming home after the war. And your parents, gone, father before the war, mother just after." His tone was matter-of-fact, but Katherine caught the flicker of old grief in his eyes. "What about you? No other family at all?" Katherine shook her head. "Father was an only child, and mother's family disowned her when she married him." He was a carpenter's son, not suitable for the daughter of a prominent merchant, according to my grandfather. She smiled wryly. I sometimes wonder what the old man would think if he could see me now, running a homestead in Montana territory. Probably have apoplexy on the spot, Kieran said with a grin, and Katherine couldn't help laughing at the image. Most certainly, though he might be grudgingly impressed, he always did value self-sufficiency even while insisting women weren't capable of it. Kieran studied her for a moment. You've proven him wrong then. Not many women or men, for that matter, could handle a homestead alone. The simple compliment warmed Katherine more than it should have. I manage, though I won't pretend it's easy. There are days when I'm not sure how I'll keep going. She hadn't admitted that to anyone before, and the confession felt both frightening and liberating. What's the hardest part? Kieran asked, genuine interest in his voice. Katherine considered the question seriously. The physical labor I can handle, though some tasks take me twice as long as they took my father. It's the isolation that wears on me, I think. And she hesitated, then continued, and the fear. Being alone means there's no one to turn to when things go wrong. Kieran nodded slowly. I understand that. It's why I keep Thunder, even though a less spirited horse might be more practical. Sometimes talking to another living creature is all that keeps the silence from becoming too heavy. The simple admission revealed more about Kieran Westley than perhaps he'd intended. Katherine found herself warming to this quiet man who understood loneliness but didn't surrender to it. After breakfast, Katherine insisted on helping with the dishes, and they fell into an easy rhythm, she washing, he drying and putting away. The domesticity of the task brought a strange comfort, and Katherine found herself imagining what it might be like to share her daily chores with someone instead of facing them alone. Your dress should be dry by now, Kieran said when they finished. Though it might be more practical to keep wearing those clothes while we're stuck here. Katherine glanced down at the oversized shirt and trousers she wore. They're certainly more comfortable than a corset and petticoats, she admitted with a small smile. Though I can't imagine what people would say if they could see me now. Nobody to see but me and Thunder, Kieran pointed out, and neither of us is likely to gossip. The rain continued throughout the morning, sometimes slackening to a gentle patter, other times intensifying into driving sheets that obscured the view from the cabin's small windows. Katherine found herself surprisingly content despite the circumstances, helping Kieran with small tasks around the cabin and listening as he explained his life on the frontier. I started as a ranch hand, he told her as they worked together to repair a tear in one of his shirts, Katherine sewing while Kieran sorted through a box of fishing tackle. Barely knew one end of a cow from the other when I first came west. And now? Katherine asked, deftly working her needle through the rough fabric. A smile touched Kieran's lips. Now I'm what they call a top hand, good with horses especially. Mr. Montgomery relies on me to break the wildest ones. That sounds dangerous, Katherine observed, trying to imagine this steady, quiet man engaged in a battle of wills with a wild Mustang. It can be, Kieran acknowledged. Broke 3 ribs last spring when a stallion threw me into a fence post. But there's something about working with horses that settles my mind like nothing else. My father was the same way about carpentry, Katherine said. He could lose himself for hours working on a piece of furniture, come out of it looking more at peace than any other time. Everyone needs something like that, Kieran agreed. What's yours? The question caught Katherine by surprise. I'm not sure I have one, she admitted after a moment's thought. Since father died, there's been so much necessary work that I haven't had time for much else. But before. Kieran pressed gently, Katherine's hands stilled on her sewing. I used to love to read. Father brought as many books as he could carry when we came west, and I read them over and over. Poetry, especially Wordsworth, Keats, Tennyson. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield, Kieran quoted softly. Katherine looked up in surprise. You know Tennyson? A flush crept up Kieran's neck. I may look like just another cowpoke, but my mother was a schoolteacher before she married. She made sure her children were educated, even if we never had much money. I didn't mean, Katherine began, embarrassed to have given the impression she thought him uneducated. No offense taken, Kieran assured her with a smile. Most folks are surprised to find a cowboy who can recite poetry. It doesn't exactly fit with the image. Well, I think it's wonderful, Katherine said sincerely. My father always said that books are the one treasure you can carry with you anywhere. A wise man, Kieran observed. I keep a few volumes here myself, though I don't get much time for reading during the busy seasons. Katherine glanced around the cabin, noticing for the first time a small shelf mounted on the wall near the bed. Sure enough, several leather-bound books were arranged neatly there. May I? She asked, setting aside her sewing. At Kieran's nod, she crossed to examine the collection. There weren't many, perhaps a dozen volumes in all, but the selection spoke volumes about the man who owned them. Whitman's Leaves of Grass, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, Thoreau's Walden, and several novels including Moby Dick and The Last of the Mohicans. A man of varied tastes, Katherine remarked, running her fingers lightly over the spines. Life's too short to limit yourself, Kieran replied, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. My sister sends me a new book every Christmas. Says she worries about my mind going fallow out here in the wilderness. Katherine smiled, pulling out the volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. May I borrow this? It's been too long since I've read purely for pleasure. Of course, Kieran said, and something in his tone made Katherine look up. The warmth in his gaze caused her heart to beat a little faster, and she quickly returned her attention to the book in her hands. The day passed more quickly than Katherine would have expected, given their confinement. The rain continued unabated, but inside the cabin, a comfortable routine established itself. Kieran went out periodically to check on Thunder and assess the flood's progress, returning with increasingly grim reports of the water's rise. The good news, he announced after his late afternoon excursion, shaking water from his hat as he stepped inside, is that this cabin is well above the flood line. The bad news is that the valley below is completely submerged and the rain shows no sign of stopping. Katherine looked up from where she sat by the fire, the borrowed book of sonnets open on her lap. How long do you think we'll be stranded? Kieran hung his wet coat by the door and ran a hand through his damp hair. Hard to say, 3 days at minimum, possibly a week if the rain keeps up. He glanced at her, concern evident in his expression. I know that's not what you wanted to hear. No, Katherine admitted, but I'm grateful to have shelter and company. It could be much worse. That it could, Kieran agreed, crossing to the fire to warm his hands. You could have been caught in that flood, or stuck alone at your homestead with provisions running low. The thought sobered Katherine. I suppose I should count my blessings instead of worrying about proprieties that hardly seem to matter out here anyway. Kieran gave her a considering look. Proprieties always matter to those who care about them, but sometimes circumstances force us to adapt. He moved to the stove, lifting the lid on a pot that had been simmering most of the afternoon. Rabbit stew's ready. I caught a couple in my snares this morning. The meal was simple but delicious, the meat tender and flavorful. As they ate, Katherine found herself telling Kieran about her life back in Boston, the society she'd left behind, and her father's dreams of building a new life in the West. He believed in the frontier, she explained, in the idea that a man could make his own destiny here, regardless of his background or circumstances. Many do, Kieran agreed, though it's a hard land. It doesn't forgive mistakes easily. No, Katherine said quietly, thinking of her father's final illness, how quickly he had failed once the pneumonia took hold. It doesn't. Perhaps sensing the direction of her thoughts, Kieran changed the subject. Tell me about your homestead. What are you growing? Grateful for the diversion, Katherine described her small farm, the vegetable garden she'd expanded that spring, the 4 chickens that provided eggs, the milk cow her father had traded for just before he died, the single field of wheat they'd managed to clear and plant. It's not much compared to the big ranches, she admitted, but it's enough to sustain me with a little left over to sell or trade in town. It sounds like you've done well, Kieran said. Many homesteaders give up within the first year. The fact that you've kept it going alone speaks to your determination. Or my stubbornness, Katherine said with a self-deprecating smile. My father always said I had more grit than sense. A valuable quality on the frontier, Kieran observed, his blue eyes warm with what looked like admiration. Grit keeps you alive when sense might tell you to give up. As evening deepened into night, Katherine found herself reluctant to end their conversation. There was something compelling about Kieran Westley, not just his undeniable good looks, but the quiet intelligence behind his words, the way he listened as if truly interested in what she had to say. Eventually, however, yawns began to punctuate their discussion, and Kieran rose to prepare his bedroll by the fire. "You should take the bed again," he insisted when Katherine began to protest. "I've slept on harder ground than this cabin floor plenty of times." Too tired to argue, Katherine retired to the narrow bed, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. From her position, she could see Kieran's profile as he sat by the fire, adding a final log before settling down for the night. The flickering flames cast his features in gold and shadow, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the thoughtful set of his mouth. "Kieran," she said softly. He turned his head toward her. "Yes, thank you, not just for saving me, but for making this situation feel normal somehow." A smile curved his lips, visible even in the dim light. "You're welcome, Katherine. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow's another day." As Katherine drifted towards sleep, lulled by the sound of rain on the roof and the occasional crackle of the fire, she found herself thinking that being stranded with Kieran Westley might not be a hardship after all. In fact, a small voice in her heart whispered it might be the most unexpected blessing she'd encountered since coming west. The second morning dawned with the same persistent rain, though Katherine woke to find the cabin empty. A note propped against the coffee pot informed her that Kieran had gone to check the flood's progress and would return shortly. Not wanting to be idle, she set about tidying the cabin, straightening Kieran's few possessions and sweeping the rough plank floor with the crude broom she found in the corner. She was just putting fresh coffee on to boil when the door opened, admitting a thoroughly soaked Kieran. The expression on his face told her all she needed to know even before he spoke. "Still rising," he confirmed, removing his dripping hat. "We got more rain overnight than I expected. The good news is that the cabin and the high ground around it are still well above the water line. The bad news." "We're still stranded," Katherine finished for him. Kieran nodded, shrugging out of his wet coat. "For several more days at least. I climbed to the highest point I could reach safely, tried to get a view of the valley, water as far as I could see." Katherine handed him a towel she'd found in his sparse belongings. "Here, dry yourself before you catch a chill. The coffee's almost ready." "Thanks," Kieran said, taking the towel with a grateful smile. As he rubbed it vigorously over his hair, he added, "I checked the lean-to as well." "Thunder's comfortable enough, though he's not happy about being cooped up." "Like his master, I imagine," Katherine said with a small smile. She'd already noticed how Kieran seemed most at ease when he was in motion, tending to tasks around the cabin or checking the surroundings. Confinement clearly didn't sit well with him. "I've been in tighter spots," Kieran replied, hanging the damp towel near the fire. "At least here we have shelter, food, and dry clothes." He glanced at her, a teasing light entering his eyes. "And the company's certainly better than the last time I was stranded. Spent 3 days in a lined shack with old Pete Wilson during a blizzard 2 winters back. Man snores loud enough to wake the dead and hasn't bathed since the war ended, near as I can tell." Katherine laughed, the sound bright in the small cabin. "Well, I hope I present a more pleasant alternative." Something flickered in Kieran's eyes, there and gone so quickly Katherine thought she might have imagined it. "That you do, Miss Lee, that you do." The day stretched before them, empty of pressing obligations but filled with the small tasks necessary for comfort and survival. Kieran spent some time checking his supplies, taking inventory of what they had and how long it would last. "We're in good shape for food," he announced, returning from the small root cellar built into the hillside behind the cabin. "Plenty of preserved vegetables, some jerky, flour, coffee, and sugar, plus whatever game I can snare when the rain lets up a bit." Katherine, who had been reading by the fire, looked up with relief. That's good to hear. I'd hate to add starvation to our list of concerns. No chance of that, Kieran assured her. I've learned to prepare for the worst out here. Winter can trap you for weeks sometimes. A comfortable silence fell between them as Kieran set about cleaning his rifle at the table while Katherine returned to her book. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, creating a soothing backdrop to their quiet activities. After a while, Katherine found herself watching Kieran instead of reading, observing the deft movements of his hands as he worked, the concentration in his expression. He glanced up suddenly, catching her gaze. Katherine quickly looked down at her book, embarrassed to be caught staring, but not before she saw the small smile that curved Kieran's lips. "Finding Shakespeare to your liking?" he asked, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of something that made Katherine's pulse quicken. "Very much," she replied, keeping her eyes firmly on the page, "though some of the sonnets are more compelling than others." "Which is your favorite?" Kieran asked, setting aside his cleaning cloth. Katherine considered the question seriously. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, perhaps? Or let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments?" Sonnet 116, Kieran identified immediately. "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds or bends with the remover to remove." The ease with which he recited the lines surprised her once again. "You know it by heart." Kieran nodded, a faint flush coloring his cheekbones. "My mother's favorite. She used to say it was the truest description of love she'd ever encountered." "And do you agree?" Katherine asked, curious about his perspective. Kieran was silent for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "I think Shakespeare got it right," he said finally. "True love doesn't change when circumstances do. It remains constant even when everything else falls apart." He looked down at the rifle in his hands. "I saw men in the war who received Dear John letters from sweethearts who couldn't wait, and others who came home to find wives who'd stood by them through years of silence and uncertainty. The difference always seemed to be exactly what Shakespeare described, whether their love could weather alteration or not." "You speak as if you've observed rather than experienced," Katherine noted, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the observation. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous of me," but Kieran didn't seem offended. "No need to apologize. You're right, I'm speaking as an observer. I've never been in love myself." He reassembled the rifle with practiced ease, his hands never hesitating despite the personal nature of their conversation. "Hard to court a woman properly when you spend most of your time in the saddle or in a cabin miles from the nearest settlement." "I imagine so," Katherine agreed, thinking of her own limited experiences with courtship. There had been a young man back in Boston who'd shown interest before her father decided to move west, and a shopkeeper's son in town who'd called on her a few times after her father died, more interested in acquiring her land than her affections, she suspected. "What about you?" Kieran asked, glancing up from his work. "Has some fortunate fellow captured your heart?" Katherine shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "Like you, I've had little opportunity, and the men who have shown interest." She hesitated, then continued honestly, "They seemed more concerned with having someone to cook and clean than a true partner." "Their loss," Kieran said simply, the sincerity in his voice warming Katherine from within. The day passed in similar fashion, with periods of conversation interspersed with comfortable silence as they each attended to small tasks. Kieran ventured out again in the afternoon, despite the continuing rain, returning with a brace of rabbits for their supper. Katherine insisted on preparing the meal, glad to contribute something in return for his hospitality. "This is delicious," Kieran said appreciatively as they ate. "You've turned my simple provisions into something special." "Just a few herbs I found in your stores," Katherine replied, pleased by his praise. "My mother taught me that good cooking is as much about creativity as it is about following recipes." "A wise woman," Kieran observed. "Was she a good cook?" "The best," Katherine said, smiling at the memory. "Even when illness had taken most of her strength, she insisted on directing me from her chair in the kitchen, teaching me everything she knew." The smile faded. "I was only 13 when she died. Sometimes I worry I'll forget the sound of her voice." Kieran reached across the table, his hand covering hers briefly in a gesture of comfort. You won't. The people we love stay with us, even when they're gone. The simple touch of his hand on hers sent a warmth spreading up Catherine's arm, and she found herself wishing he hadn't withdrawn it so quickly. The thought startled her. Was she developing feelings for this quiet cowboy? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. As evening deepened around them, the cabin grew chilly despite the fire. Katherine found herself shivering slightly as she helped Kieran clean up after their meal. Cold? He asked, noticing immediately. A little, she admitted. The temperature seems to have dropped. Kieran nodded. Storms shifting sometimes brings colder air down from the mountains. He moved to a trunk in the corner, rummaging briefly before producing a thick woolen sweater. Here, this should help. Katherine accepted the garment gratefully, slipping it over Kieran's borrowed shirt. The sweater was comically large on her slender frame, but wonderfully warm, carrying the same pine and leather scent she now associated with Kieran. Better, he asked, watching her with a mixture of amusement and something else she couldn't quite identify. Much thank you, Katherine replied, rolling up the overlong sleeves, though I must look ridiculous. Not at all, Kieran said softly, his eyes lingering on her face a moment longer than necessary before he turned away to add wood to the fire. Actually, you look. He paused, seeming to search for the right word. Right, he finished simply. The word hung in the air between them, laden with meaning Katherine wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. An unfamiliar tension filled the small cabin, not unpleasant but charged with possibilities neither of them had voiced. To break the moment, Katherine moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain to look out at the night. The rain continued to fall, silver streaks visible in the darkness whenever lightning flashed in the distance. Will it ever stop? She wondered aloud. Eventually, Kieran replied, coming to stand beside her. Nature has its own timetable, one we mere mortals can only accept, not change. They stood side by side, watching the storm rage outside their small haven. Katherine was acutely aware of Kieran's presence beside her, the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the faint scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to him. It's beautiful in its way, she murmured. Terrifying, but beautiful. Like so much in life, Kieran agreed, his voice low, the most beautiful things often carry the greatest danger. Katherine turned her head to find him looking not at the storm, but at her. The intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch in her throat. For a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her, wanted him to kiss her, she realized with a shock of clarity. Instead, Kieran stepped back, breaking the spell. We should get some sleep, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Morning comes early, regardless of the weather. Disappointed yet relieved, Katherine nodded. Of course. Good night, Kieran. Good night, Katherine, he replied, already turning toward his bedroll by the fire. As Katherine lay in Kieran's bed that night, listening to the rain and the occasional crackle of the fire, she acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling for Kieran Westley. The realization was as frightening as it was exhilarating. 3 days ago, he had been a complete stranger. Now, she couldn't imagine her life without him in it, but what would happen when the waters receded and they returned to their separate lives? Katherine had no answer to that question as sleep finally claimed her, carrying her into dreams where a blue-eyed cowboy rode through endless golden prairies, always with her by his side. The third day of their confinement brought a subtle shift in the weather. Though rain still fell, it came as a gentle mist rather than the driving downpour of previous days. Kieran, returning from his morning check of the surroundings, brought cautiously optimistic news. The waters stopped rising, he reported, hanging his damp hat by the door. If this lighter rain continues, we might see the flood begin to recede by tomorrow or the day after. Katherine greeted this information with mixed emotions. On one hand, she was anxious to return to her homestead to ensure her animals and property had weathered the flood. On the other hand, the prospect of leaving Kieran's cabin and Kieran himself filled her with an unexpected sadness. That's good news, she said, forcing brightness into her tone as she handed him a cup of coffee. Kieran accepted the cup, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. The brief contact sent a familiar warmth through Katherine, and she quickly turned away to hide her reaction. Once the water starts to recede, how long before the paths are passable? She asked, busying herself with straightening items on the small shelf near the stove. Depends on how much damage the flood has done, Kieran replied, settling into a chair by the fire. Could be a day, could be several. We won't know until we can see what we're dealing with. Katherine nodded, trying to focus on practical matters rather than the confusing emotions swirling within her. I'll need to return home as soon as possible. My livestock, I understand, Kieran assured her, and I'll take you there myself as soon as it's safe to travel. But rushing into floodwaters would be foolhardy. I know, Katherine sighed, joining him by the fire. I just feel so helpless, sitting here while my home might be in jeopardy. Waiting is often the hardest part, Kieran agreed, his blue eyes sympathetic. But sometimes it's the only option we have. The day stretched before them, another period of confinement in the small cabin. To pass the time, Kieran suggested teaching Katherine how to play poker using a battered deck of cards he produced from a drawer. I should warn you, Katherine said with a smile as he dealt the cards. My father taught me to play when I was 12. He said every lady should know how to spot a cheater at cards. Kieran's eyebrows rose in surprise. A progressive man, your father. He believed women were just as capable as men in most things, Katherine replied, arranging her cards. He just thought society hadn't caught up to that reality yet. A man ahead of his time, Kieran commented, studying his own cards, and a wise one from what you've told me about him. They played several hands, with Katherine proving her father's tutelage had been thorough. She won more often than not, much to Kieran's amused chagrin. I should have known better than to play against a Boston lady, he complained good-naturedly after losing his third consecutive hand. City folk are always sharper at cards than us simple country types. Katherine laughed, the sound bright in the cozy cabin. Don't try that innocent cowboy act with me, Kieran Westley. I've seen how you calculate odds in your head. You're letting me win. Kieran's smile confirmed her accusation. Maybe I just enjoy seeing you happy, he said, his tone light but his eyes serious as they met hers across the table. The simple statement sent Katherine's heart racing. She looked down at her cards, suddenly flustered by the implication of his words. Your deal, she said, pushing the deck toward him. As the day progressed, the lighter rain created a different atmosphere in the cabin, less one of forced shelter from a threatening storm, and more a peaceful retreat from the outside world. The steady patter on the roof became a soothing background to their conversations, which ranged widely from books they'd read to places they'd seen, dreams they still harbored. I'd like to see the ocean again someday, Katherine admitted as they prepared a simple lunch together. I miss the smell of salt air, the endless horizon where sky meets water. I've never seen it, Kieran confessed. The ocean, I mean, never made it further east than Chicago or further west than this territory. Oh, it's magnificent, Katherine said, her eyes lighting up with the memory. Terrifying and beautiful at once, rather like the mountains here, but always changing, always moving. Perhaps I'll see it someday, Kieran mused, though I can't imagine leaving this land for long. It has a hold on me I can't explain. I understand that, Katherine said softly. Despite everything, the hardships, the isolation, the dangers, there's something about this place that gets into your blood. Kieran nodded, a smile touching his lips. Exactly, the vastness of it, the freedom, the sense that you're seeing something few human eyes have witnessed before. The rawness of it, Katherine added, everything is so immediate, so real. Back east, life seemed to happen at a remove, filtered through proprieties and social expectations. And do you miss that? Kieran asked, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. The comforts of civilization, the society of other ladies, proper tea parties and such, Katherine considered the question seriously. Sometimes, she admitted. Particularly in winter when the isolation is most acute, but would I trade this life to return to that one? She shook her head. No. Despite everything, I belong here now. Something like approval flashed in Kieran's eyes. Not every Eastern lady adapts so well to frontier life. Many come with their husbands or families and end up returning east within a year, unable to endure the hardships. I'm not most ladies, Katherine replied with a small smile. No, Kieran agreed, his voice dropping slightly. You're certainly not. The way he looked at her then, as if truly seeing her, valuing what he saw, made Katherine's breath catch. No man had ever looked at her quite that way before, with a mixture of admiration, respect, and something warmer that made her pulse quicken. As afternoon faded into evening, the rain finally stopped altogether. Kieran stepped outside to check the sky, returning with cautious optimism. Clouds are breaking up, he reported. If the rain holds off overnight, we might see significant improvement by morning. They ate a quiet dinner, both aware that their time together might be drawing to a close. Neither mentioned it directly, but the knowledge hung between them, lending a bittersweet quality to their conversation. After the meal, they sat by the fire, Kieran whittling a piece of wood while Katherine read aloud from the Book of Sonnets. The domesticity of the scene struck Katherine suddenly how natural it felt to share this quiet evening with Kieran, as if they had been doing so for years rather than days. You read beautifully, Kieran observed when she paused between poems. You have a way of bringing the words to life. Katherine smiled, pleased by the compliment. My mother loved poetry. She used to read to my father and me in the evenings, just like this. She ran her fingers over the worn page. These moments, quiet evenings by the fire, they're what I miss most about family life. The simple things, Kieran agreed, his knife pausing in its work. They matter more than we realize until they're gone. Yes, Katherine said softly, exactly that. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and Katherine felt something shift, as if a decision had been made, though neither had spoken it aloud. Kieran set aside his whittling and moved to sit beside her on the bench near the fire, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Katherine, he began, his voice lower than usual. These past days, a sudden crash outside interrupted him, followed by the frightened whinny of his horse. Kieran was on his feet instantly, reaching for his rifle. Stay here, he ordered, his tone brooking no argument as he moved swiftly to the door. Katherine's heart raced with sudden fear as Kieran disappeared into the darkness outside. She heard him calling to Thunder, his voice steady despite the potential danger. After what seemed an eternity but was probably only minutes, the cabin door reopened to admit a mud-splattered Kieran. Tree branch came down on the lean-to, he explained, setting his rifle aside. Spooked Thunder, but no harm done. The structure's still sound. Relief washed over Katherine. Thank goodness, I was worried. Just nature reminding us who's really in charge, Kieran said with a small smile, though his eyes remained watchful. I'll need to check the surroundings thoroughly in daylight. There could be other damage we haven't discovered yet. The moment that had been building between them before the interruption had passed, and Katherine felt its loss keenly. Kieran seemed to sense her disappointment, for he moved to stand before her, his expression gentle. It's getting late, he said softly. We should rest. Morning will bring clearer skies and new possibilities. There was a promise in his words that Katherine clung to as she retired to his bed for what might be the last night. Whatever Kieran had been about to say before the interruption, she sensed it had been important, perhaps even life-changing. The thought kept her awake long after his breathing had evened out into sleep by the fire, her mind racing with possibilities both thrilling and terrifying. What would tomorrow bring? And more importantly, what would happen between them when their enforced isolation ended? Katherine had no answers as she finally drifted into uneasy sleep. Only questions and the growing certainty that her life had changed irrevocably the moment Kieran Westley had pulled her from the rising river. The fourth morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the cabin windows for the first time since Katherine's arrival. She woke to find the cabin empty once again, though the coffee pot bubbling on the stove told her Kieran hadn't been gone long. Katherine dressed quickly in her own clothes, which had long since dried, though she kept Kieran's sweater over her dress for warmth. Outside, birds sang in the surrounding trees, their cheerful notes a stark contrast to the ominous silence of the storm days. The cabin door opened to admit Kieran, his expression caught between relief and concern. "Good morning," he greeted her. "I've been surveying the damage." "And?" Katherine asked, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "The flood has crested," Kieran reported, accepting the cup she offered. "Waters are beginning to recede, but slowly. The valley's still largely underwater, though I can see some of the higher points emerging." He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "The path to town remains impassable, but I think I could get us to your homestead by tomorrow if we take the high route through the eastern ridges." "Tomorrow," Katherine repeated, both relieved and strangely disappointed. "So soon." Kieran studied her over the rim of his cup, his blue eyes unreadable. "Are you in a hurry to be rid of me, Miss Lee?" he asked, a teasing note in his voice that didn't quite mask the genuine question beneath. "Not at all," Katherine replied honestly. "These days have been—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Unexpected," she finished, "but not unwelcome." Something softened in Kieran's expression. "For me as well," he said quietly, "more than you know." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Kieran set down his cup and moved toward the door. "I need to check the trail conditions more thoroughly if we're to attempt the journey tomorrow. Would you like to accompany me? After being cooped up in this cabin for days, some fresh air might be welcome." Eager for both the exercise and the continued company, Katherine agreed readily. They set out on foot, climbing the ridge behind the cabin to gain a better view of the surrounding landscape. The sight that greeted them at the summit was both awesome and terrible. The valley below, usually a patchwork of meadows and woodlands, had been transformed into a vast lake. Here and there, the tops of taller trees emerged from the floodwaters, and the occasional higher point of land formed small islands in the newly created sea. "My God," Katherine breathed, taking in the scale of the flooding. "It's worse than I imagined," Kieran nodded grimly. "This is why I was so concerned when I saw you by the river. Spring floods are no joke in these parts." He pointed toward the southern horizon. "Your homestead should be in that direction, though we can't see it from here. If it's on high ground, as you said, it's probably above the worst of the flooding." "I hope so," Katherine murmured, thinking of her small farm with its carefully tended garden and modest collection of livestock. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Kieran seemed to read her thoughts. "We'll get there as soon as it's safe," he promised, "and whatever we find, you won't face it alone." The simple pledge, offered without hesitation, touched Katherine deeply. "Thank you, Kieran, for everything." They stood side by side on the ridge, surveying the transformed landscape below. The sun was warm on their faces despite the chill in the air, a promise of the spring that would follow once the floodwaters receded. "It's beautiful in a terrible way," Katherine observed after a while. "Nature's power laid bare. The frontier strips away illusions," Kieran agreed. "Back east, people build cities and imagine they've conquered the wilderness. Out here, we know better. We live at nature's mercy always." "And yet you choose this life," Katherine said, studying his profile against the blue sky. "You could return to civilization, but you stay." Kieran was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "The war showed me the worst of humanity," he said finally, his voice low. "Out here among the mountains and prairies, I found something better, a kind of peace I couldn't find elsewhere." "And the solitude doesn't trouble you?" Katherine asked, genuinely curious. "Sometimes," Kieran admitted. "Winter nights can grow long when it's just you and your thoughts." He glanced at her, a half-smile touching his lips. "But the alternative has its drawbacks too. Towns mean politics and gossip and people always in your business." "True enough," Katherine agreed with a laugh. "Even our small settlement has its share of busybodies. Mrs. Peterson from the general store knows everyone's affairs better than they do themselves." "Every town has a Mrs. Peterson," Kieran said, chuckling. "In Cooperville, it's Mrs. Holloway from the boarding house. Nothing happens that she doesn't know about and have an opinion on." "Oh dear," Katherine said, her smile fading slightly. "Mrs. Holloway, I'd nearly forgotten. What will people think when they learn I've been staying alone with you all this time?" Kieran's expression grew serious. "Are you concerned about gossip?" Katherine sighed, running a hand over her hair, which she'd hastily pinned up before their walk. I should be, shouldn't I? A proper lady would be mortified at the impropriety of the situation. She looked out over the flooded valley, considering. But somehow I find I care less than I probably should. The rules of Boston society seem very far away from this ridge. The frontier has its own rules, Kieran said quietly. Survival matters more than proprieties. Anyone who's lived out here long enough understands that. Perhaps, Katherine conceded, but reputations still matter, especially for a woman alone. Kieran was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. There's a simple solution, of course. One that would silence any gossip before it could start. Katherine's heart began to beat faster, though she kept her tone equally casual. Oh, and what might that be? Kieran turned to face her fully, the sun highlighting the gold flecks in his blue eyes. Marriage, he said simply. Katherine's breath caught in her throat. Marriage, she repeated, sure she must have misunderstood. I realize it's sudden, Kieran continued, his voice steady though she could see the pulse jumping in his throat. And perhaps even inappropriate given how short a time we've known each other. But he paused, seeming to gather his courage. These past days have shown me something I wasn't expecting to find. In you, Katherine, I see a woman of extraordinary courage and grace, someone I'd be proud to build a life with if you'd consider it. Stunned, Katherine could only stare at him, her mind racing to catch up with this unexpected turn. You're proposing, now, here? A wry smile touched Kieran's lips. I admit the timing and setting aren't what I would have chosen. In a perfect world, I'd have courted you properly, called at your home, taken you for rides or to town gatherings, given you time to know your own mind. The smile faded, replaced by earnest intensity. But life on the frontier rarely follows conventional paths. And I find I don't want to waste time on formalities when I already know what I want. And what is that? Katherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You, Kieran said simply, by my side, as my wife, my partner, my companion through whatever life brings. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. I'm not a wealthy man, Katherine. I have this cabin, my horse, and my reputation as a reliable hand, but I can offer you protection, partnership, and my word that I'll always treat you with respect. Katherine's head spun with the suddenness of it all. 4 days ago, Kieran Westley had been a stranger. Now he was proposing marriage. It was madness by any conventional standard. And yet there was something between them, something that had grown with surprising speed and strength during their days of confinement. A connection she couldn't deny or easily dismiss. In Kieran, she recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood the pull of this wild land, who valued honesty and courage, who saw her as she truly was. This is unexpected, she managed finally, buying time to organize her thoughts. I know, Kieran acknowledged, his grip on her hand gentle but secure. And I don't expect an answer this moment. Take time to consider, please, but know that my offer is sincere. He hesitated, then added softly, I think we could build something good together, Katherine. Something that would honor both our independent natures while giving us the companionship neither of us has admitted we need. The words struck a chord deep within Katherine. Wasn't that exactly what she'd been missing since her father's death? Not just help with the physical labor of the homestead, but partnership. Someone to share the burdens and joys, the decisions and dreams. May I ask what prompted this? She inquired, her voice steadier than she'd expected. Is it only concern for my reputation, or? No, Kieran said firmly. Though I do care about your standing in the community, that's not my primary motivation. He took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving her face. The truth is, Katherine, I felt drawn to you from the moment I pulled you from that river. Your courage, your determination, your quick wit, all of it appeals to me in ways I wasn't prepared for. We barely know each other, Katherine pointed out, though her heart was racing at his words. True, Kieran conceded. And yet I feel I know the essential things about you already. I know you're brave enough to face frontier life alone after losing your father. I know you're intelligent and well-read, with opinions you're not afraid to express. I know you value independence but understand the importance of community." His lips curved in a small smile. "And I know you cheat at poker." Katherine laughed despite the tension of the moment. "I do not cheat, I'm simply better than you expected." "That you are," Kieran agreed, his expression growing serious again. "In all ways, you've exceeded any expectations I might have had. And I find myself unwilling to simply escort you home tomorrow and ride away, returning to my solitary existence as if these days meant nothing." Put like that, Katherine couldn't imagine it either saying goodbye to Kieran, watching him ride away, perhaps seeing him occasionally in town but nothing more. The thought left an ache in her chest she couldn't ignore. She began, then faltered, overwhelmed by the decision before her. "This is so sudden, Kieran. Marriage is a lifetime commitment." "It is," he agreed solemnly, "and I wouldn't suggest it if I weren't prepared for exactly that, but I understand your hesitation." He released her hand, stepping back slightly to give her space. "Take time to consider. We have at least until tomorrow before the trail to your homestead is passable." Katherine nodded, grateful for the reprieve yet strangely reluctant to end the conversation. "Thank you. I will think about it, I promise." They stood in silence for a moment longer, the weight of Kieran's proposal hanging between them. Finally, he gestured back toward the path they'd climbed. "We should head back. There's still much to do if we're to leave tomorrow." The walk back to the cabin was quieter than their ascent had been, each lost in their own thoughts. Katherine's mind whirled with possibilities, fears, and hopes. Marriage to Kieran would solve many practical problems: her isolation, the difficulty of managing the homestead alone, the gossip about her stay at his cabin. But marriage should be more than a practical arrangement, shouldn't it? And yet, she couldn't deny the attraction between them, the easy companionship they'd established in just a few days. There was something about Kieran Westley that called to her, something that made her feel both safe and exhilarated at once. Back at the cabin, they fell into the now familiar routine of shared tasks, Kieran checking his gear and preparing the horse for their journey tomorrow, Katherine taking stock of provisions and helping to clean and organize the small living space. They worked alongside each other with the easy coordination of people who'd done so for years rather than days, anticipating each other's needs without words. As evening approached, Kieran prepared to venture out one last time to check the trail conditions. "I won't be long," he promised, donning his hat and coat. "Just want to make sure our route for tomorrow is clear." "Be careful," Katherine said, the concern in her voice genuine. Though the flood had crested, the danger hadn't passed entirely. Kieran paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that made her heart skip a beat. "Always," he promised softly before disappearing into the gathering dusk. Alone in the cabin, Katherine found her thoughts returning inevitably to Kieran's proposal. Was she truly considering it? Marriage to a man she'd known less than a week. By any conventional standard, it was madness. And yet life on the frontier had its own standards. How many women had traveled west as mail-order brides, marrying men they'd never met until they stepped off the stagecoach? How many couples had formed partnerships of convenience that grew into genuine affection over time? Moreover, there was nothing conventional about her situation. A woman alone on a homestead was vulnerable in ways that went beyond physical danger. Without male protection, she was at the mercy of any unscrupulous neighbor or businessman who might try to take advantage. She'd already fended off one attempt by the banker in town to acquire her land at far below its value, claiming she couldn't possibly manage it alone. But practical considerations aside, what of her own feelings? In the quiet of the cabin, Katherine forced herself to confront the truth she'd been avoiding. She was attracted to Kieran Westley. More than attracted, she admired his quiet strength, his intelligence, his self-sufficiency. She enjoyed his company, found comfort in his presence, and yes, felt her pulse quicken when their eyes met. Was that enough to build a marriage on? Katherine wasn't sure, but she was increasingly certain that she didn't want tomorrow to be the end of whatever was growing between them. The cabin door opened, admitting Kieran along with a gust of cool evening air. His expression was satisfied as he hung up his hat. "Trail looks good," he reported, If we leave at first light, we should reach your homestead by mid-afternoon." Katherine nodded, trying to hide the tumult of emotions his simple statement evoked. "Tomorrow, so soon." "I've been thinking," Kieran continued, moving to stoke the fire. "Regardless of your decision about my proposal, I'd like to help you assess any damage to your property. Make any necessary repairs before I leave." His consideration touched her. "That's very kind, Kieran, thank you." He straightened, facing her across the small cabin. "Not kindness," he corrected gently, "just the right thing to do." The simplicity of the statement encapsulated so much of what Katherine had come to appreciate about Kieran. He didn't make grand gestures or flowery promises. He simply did what needed doing, with quiet competence and without expectation of reward. They prepared their evening meal together, the familiar routine now tinged with awareness that it might be their last night in the cabin. Conversation flowed easily between them, touching on practical matters for the journey ahead as well as lighter topics that brought smiles to both their faces. After the meal, as they sat by the fire with cups of coffee, Kieran broke the comfortable silence with a question. "Have you given any thought to my proposal?" he asked, his tone careful, neutral. Katherine met his gaze steadily. "I've thought of little else all afternoon," she admitted. Kieran waited, not pressing, giving her space to continue at her own pace. Katherine appreciated his patience, so different from the demanding nature of most men she'd known. "Marriage is a serious commitment," she began. "One that shouldn't be entered into lightly, especially in circumstances like ours, where survival often depends on both parties fulfilling their obligations." Kieran nodded, his expression grave. "I agree completely." "And yet," Katherine continued, "life on the frontier doesn't always allow for conventional courtships or extended acquaintance before such decisions must be made." "No," Kieran agreed softly. "It doesn't." Katherine took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I find myself at a crossroads, Kieran. The sensible part of me says we should take more time, get to know each other better before considering something as permanent as marriage." "And what does the rest of you say?" Kieran asked, his blue eyes intent on her face. Katherine smiled slightly. "The rest of me remembers that my parents knew within a week of meeting that they wanted to spend their lives together. My mother always said that when it's right, you know, and that sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind is still puzzling over." Hope flared in Kieran's expression, though he kept his voice steady. "And what is your heart telling you, Katherine?" "That there's something between us worth exploring," she admitted. "That in just a few days, you've come to mean more to me than I could have imagined possible. That the thought of saying goodbye tomorrow fills me with a sadness I wasn't prepared for." Kieran set his coffee cup aside and moved to kneel before her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Then don't say goodbye," he said simply. "Say yes instead. Become my wife. Let us face whatever comes together as partners." Katherine looked down at their joined hands, as large and calloused from years of hard work, hers smaller but equally marked by labor. A fitting metaphor for what he was proposing. Two people shaped by different experiences but equally capable, joining forces to build something neither could create alone. "If I say yes," she began carefully, "I would have conditions." "Name them," Kieran responded without hesitation. "I don't want to give up my homestead," Katherine said firmly. "It was my father's dream, his legacy to me. I've put too much of myself into it to abandon it now." Kieran nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I wouldn't ask you to. We could make our home there if that's what you want. Or split our time between both properties if that makes more sense." Encouraged by his flexibility, Katherine continued, "I would expect a true partnership. I know that legally, as my husband, you would have certain rights over my property and decisions, but I need to know you value my opinion and will include me in choices that affect our lives." "Always," Kieran promised. "I've never believed in the notion that men should make decisions without consulting their wives. My own parents had an equal partnership, and it served them well through 30 years of marriage." Katherine smiled, relieved by his response. "And finally, I need to know that this isn't merely a practical arrangement for you. That there's feeling behind your proposal. Kieran's expression softened, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "Katherine," he said, his voice low and earnest, "there is nothing merely practical about what I feel for you. From the moment I saw you struggling against that river, something in my heart recognized you not just as someone who needed help, but as someone who belonged in my life." He released one of her hands to gently touch her cheek. "I know it's fast. I know by conventional standards we should court for months before considering marriage, but I also know that I've never felt this way about anyone before. And out here, where life can change in an instant, I see no reason to waste time denying what's already clear to both of us." The sincerity in his voice, the warmth in his eyes, left no room for doubt. Katherine felt the last of her hesitation melt away, replaced by a certainty that surprised her with its strength. "Yes," she said simply. Kieran went still, as if afraid he'd misheard. "Yes," Katherine smiled, joy bubbling up within her like a spring. "Yes, Kieran Westley, I will marry you. I will be your wife and partner, face whatever comes by your side, and build a life with you that honors both our dreams." The smile that broke across Kieran's face was like sunrise after a long night, brilliant, warm, and full of promise. Without a word, he gathered Katherine into his arms, lifting her from the chair and spinning her in a circle that made her laugh with delight. When he set her on her feet again, his hands remained at her waist, steadying her as she looked up at him with shining eyes. "May I kiss you, Miss Lee?" he asked, the formal question at odds with the intimacy of their embrace. "Seeing as we're engaged now and all." "I believe that would be appropriate, Mr. Westley," Katherine replied, her attempt at primness undermined by the smile she couldn't suppress. Kieran's hands moved to frame her face, his touch gentle as if she were something infinitely precious. Slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind, he lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. Katherine's hands found their way to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips as she responded with a shyness that quickly gave way to something warmer as Kieran deepened the kiss. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. "I promise to do everything in my power to make you happy, Katherine," he murmured. "I know," she replied simply, "and I make the same promise to you." They remained in each other's arms for a long moment, savoring the newness of their connection and the promise it held. Finally, reluctantly, Kieran stepped back, though he kept hold of her hands. "We should try to get the minister in Cooperville to marry us as soon as possible," he said, his practical nature reasserting itself. "Once the waters recede enough for travel, it would silence any gossip about our time here immediately." Katherine nodded, though the practical concerns seemed distant compared to the joy of their decision. "Yes, that makes sense, and it would give us time to prepare your cabin for both of us." Kieran smiled at her slight stumble. "We'll need to discuss where we'll make our home," he agreed. "Your homestead might make more sense, especially with livestock to consider, but we have time to figure all that out." The rest of the evening passed in a pleasant haze for Katherine. They talked of practical matters, when the wedding might take place, how they would combine their households, what the coming seasons might bring, but underlying it all was a sense of wonder at how quickly and unexpectedly their lives had changed. When it came time for sleep, Kieran insisted on maintaining propriety despite their engagement. "Just one more night," he said with a smile as he prepared his bedroll by the fire. "Soon enough we'll have the right to share a bed properly as husband and wife." Katherine blushed at his words but appreciated his respect for convention. As she settled into his bed for the final time as an unmarried woman, she found herself smiling into the darkness. 4 days ago, the rising river had seemed like a disaster, threatening her very life. Now she recognized it for what it truly was, the hand of Providence, guiding her toward a future brighter than any she could have imagined for herself. "Good night, my soon-to-be husband," she called softly across the cabin. "Good night, my bride-to-be," Kieran replied, his voice warm with promise in the firelit darkness. "Sleep well. Tomorrow we begin our journey together." As Katherine drifted toward sleep, She found herself thinking that the journey had already begun 4 days ago when a river rose too fast and a cowboy tossed her onto his horse, riding for higher ground. And what a journey it promised to be. The journey to Katherine's homestead took longer than anticipated, the trail frequently blocked by debris washed down from the hills or made treacherous by mud. Thunder carried them steadily forward, Kieran guiding the horse with sure hands while Katherine sat before him in the saddle, much as she had on that first fateful day. "There it is," she said finally, pointing toward a small cabin perched on a rise of land that remained blessedly above the waterline. Relief washed over her at the sight of her home, still standing despite the devastation that surrounded it. As they drew closer, Katherine could see that, while the cabin and outbuildings had escaped the worst of the flooding, the lower fields were submerged beneath several feet of muddy water. Her garden, thankfully on higher ground near the house, appeared sodden but intact. "My wheat," she murmured, dismayed by the sight of her flooded field. Kieran's arm tightened briefly around her waist. "It's early enough in the season that you can replant once the water recedes," he reassured her. "The soil will be even richer for the flooding." They reached the cabin just as the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the damp landscape. Katherine's heart leapt at the sound of her chickens clucking indignantly from their coop as Kieran helped her dismount. "They're alive," she exclaimed, hurrying toward the small structure to check on her birds. Inside, all 4 hens huddled together, clearly unhappy about their confinement but otherwise unharmed. "They're fine, Kieran. What about your cow?" Kieran asked, leading Thunder toward the small barn. "Bessie," Katherine supplied, following him. "She should be inside if she had any sense to get out of the rain." Sure enough, the placid Jersey cow stood in her stall, chewing contentedly on the remains of the hay Katherine had left before her ill-fated journey to town. The animal lowed a greeting, apparently unperturbed by the drama of the past few days. "She's nearly out of feed," Katherine observed, checking the hay store. "Another day or two and she'd have been hungry." "Lucky for Bessie that we made it when we did," Kieran replied with a smile, leading Thunder into an adjacent stall. "Your animals seem to have weathered the storm better than some humans I know." Katherine laughed, the relief of finding her homestead and livestock largely intact making her almost giddy. "God watches over fools and farmyard creatures," my father used to say. They spent the remaining daylight hours checking the property for damage. The cabin roof had developed a small leak in one corner, which Kieran immediately set about repairing. The well remained sound, though surrounded by a moat of muddy water that made accessing it an adventure. The garden would need considerable work once things dried out, but most of the young plants had survived. "All in all, you were fortunate," Kieran observed as they returned to the cabin at dusk. "The damage could have been much worse." "Thanks to being on high ground," Katherine agreed. Father chose the location carefully. He'd seen floods back in Ohio and knew the importance of elevation. Inside, the cabin showed signs of its 4-day abandonment, a fine layer of dust, the lingering chill of an unheated space, the musty smell of damp. Katherine immediately set about building a fire while Kieran brought in their few belongings from his saddlebags. "It feels strange," Katherine admitted as she worked, "being back here after everything that's happened." Kieran nodded, understanding in his eyes as he glanced around the small, familiar space so similar to his own cabin, yet markedly different. Feminine touches softened the frontier austerity curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the bed, a vase of dried wildflowers on the rough-hewn table. "Everything looks the same," he observed, "but nothing is it?" "No," Katherine agreed softly. "Nothing is the same at all." As the fire caught and began to warm the space, they fell into the now familiar rhythm of preparing an evening meal together. Katherine found herself marveling at how quickly they'd established these patterns, how naturally they moved around each other, anticipating needs and sharing tasks without discussion. Over supper, they discussed plans for the coming day's repairs needed, crops to be replanted once the waters receded, arrangements for their wedding once the trail to town was passable again. Pastor Fleming can perform the ceremony, Katherine said, pouring coffee for them both. He comes to Cooperville twice a month to hold services. If we're lucky, he might be there when we can finally make the journey. And if not, we can have Judge Wilson do it, Kieran suggested. A civil ceremony would be just as binding. Katherine nodded, though a small part of her had always imagined a church wedding, however simple. Reading her expression, Kieran reached across the table to take her hand. "We could have Pastor Fleming bless the marriage later, if that's important to you," he offered. "The important thing is making it official as soon as possible." "You're right," Katherine agreed, "especially given the circumstances." She blushed slightly, aware that spending additional nights alone with Kieran, even as her betrothed, would only add fuel to any potential gossip, once they returned to town. After the meal, as Katherine washed the few dishes and Kieran made one last check of the animals for the night, she found herself contemplating the sleeping arrangements. Her cabin, like Kieran's, boasted only one bed. Propriety demanded they maintain the same arrangement as at his cabin, she in the bed, he on the floor by the fire. Yet now that they were engaged, now that she had accepted him as her future husband, the strictures seemed almost absurd. Kieran, ever the gentleman, solved the dilemma without discussion upon his return. He simply collected a blanket and pillow from the bed and made himself a pallet near the hearth, much as he had at his own cabin. "Just a few more days," he said with a smile when he caught her watching him. "Then we needn't worry about sleeping arrangements any longer." Katherine nodded, grateful for his understanding and restraint. "I'll make up for it by giving you the most comfortable bed in the territory," she promised. "I'll hold you to that," Kieran replied, his tone light but his eyes dark with a promise that made Katherine's pulse quicken. The next few days established a new routine as they worked together to repair the damage from the flood and prepare for the future. Kieran proved as skilled at carpentry and farm work as he was at handling horses, fixing the roof leak, reinforcing the chicken coop, and helping Katherine salvage what they could from her garden. The waters receded gradually, revealing sodden fields and, here and there, the carcasses of animals that hadn't reached high ground in time. Each day, Kieran rode out to check the trail to town, returning with reports of steady improvement. "Another day or two," he announced on the fourth evening after their arrival at Katherine's homestead. "The main road is nearly clear, though there are still some deep mud patches that would mire a wagon." Katherine looked up from the shirt she was mending one of Kieran's that had torn during their work that day. "So soon, that's wonderful news." "It is," Kieran agreed, though Katherine thought she detected a note of hesitation in his voice. "What is it?" she asked, setting aside her sewing. "Is something wrong?" Kieran shook his head, moving to sit across from her at the table. "Not wrong exactly, but I've been thinking about our situation, about the wedding and what comes after." A flutter of anxiety stirred in Katherine's stomach, having second thoughts. "No," Kieran said firmly, reaching for her hand. "Never that. If anything, these days working alongside you have only confirmed my certainty that we belong together." He squeezed her fingers gently. "But I realize I've been so focused on making our arrangement official that I haven't given proper attention to making it special for you." Katherine's anxiety melted away, replaced by warmth at his thoughtfulness. "Oh, Kieran, that's not necessary. I understand the practical considerations that are driving our timeline. Practical considerations matter," he acknowledged. "But so do the things that make life more than mere survival. You deserve a proper wedding, Katherine, not just a hasty ceremony at the judge's office." "What are you suggesting?" Katherine asked, touched by his concern. Kieran's blue eyes were earnest as they met hers. "That we take a little more time, do things right. Let me court you properly, even if only for a week or two before the wedding. Let the people in town see us together, understand that this is a match based on genuine feeling, not just convenience after the flood." Katherine considered his proposal, both surprised and moved by his consideration. "You'd be willing to wait?" "Even knowing the gossip that might arise about our time alone together. People will talk regardless," Kieran said with a shrug. "They always do." But I'd rather give them something substantial to talk about a proper courtship, followed by a wedding that the whole community can witness than let them reduce what's between us to mere scandal. The sentiment was so unexpectedly romantic coming from the usually practical cowboy that Katherine found herself blinking back tears. "I think I'd like that," she admitted. "Not a long engagement. I'm as eager as you to begin our life together officially, but enough time to do things properly. To honor what we're building between us." Kieran's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Then that's what we'll do. As soon as the road is passable, we'll ride into town together. I'll speak to your neighbors, make our intentions clear to the community. We'll do this right, Katherine." "Thank you," she said softly, turning her hand to lace her fingers with his, "for understanding what I didn't even realize I wanted until you offered it." The tenderness in Kieran's gaze made Katherine's heart swell. This man, this thoughtful, honorable man who had saved her life and then captured her heart, continued to surprise her with his sensitivity to her feelings and needs. "May I kiss you, Katherine Lee?" he asked, his voice low. "Future Mrs. Westley." "I believe that would be entirely appropriate, Mr. Westley," she replied, her smile belying the formal words. Kieran rose from his chair, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more confident, a promise of the life they would share. Katherine melted against him, her hands finding their way into his hair as his arms tightened around her waist. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. "I'm the luckiest man in Montana Territory," he murmured. "And I the luckiest woman," Katherine replied, her heart full to bursting with joy and anticipation of the future they would build together. 2 days later, the road to town was finally declared passable. Kieran and Katherine rode double on Thunder, her few possessions packed in saddlebags. A neighbor promised to look after her livestock during their absence. The journey took most of the morning, the horse picking its way carefully around mud holes and debris still littering the trail. Cooperville appeared largely untouched by the flooding, situated as it was on higher ground than the surrounding countryside. As they rode down the main street, Katherine was acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk who recognized her riding with the tall cowboy from the Circle M Ranch. Their first stop was the telegraph office, where Kieran sent a message to his employer explaining his absence and announcing his intention to marry. Next, they visited Pastor Fleming, who was fortuitously in town for his bi-monthly services. The kindly clergyman listened to their story with evident sympathy, agreeing to perform the ceremony in 2 weeks' time after reading the banns on 2 successive Sundays. "A proper Christian wedding," he declared, beaming at the couple. "Just what's needed after such a trying ordeal. The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing you together through such perilous circumstances." From there, they made arrangements for Katherine to stay at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house until the wedding, while Kieran would take a room at the modest hotel across the street. The separation was necessary for propriety's sake, though both privately found it amusing after their days alone together. Mrs. Holloway, the town's primary source of gossip, was predictably atwitter at the news. "Well, I never," she exclaimed, her eyes darting between Katherine and Kieran. "Swept away by the flood and rescued by a handsome cowboy. It's like something from a novel, my dear." Katherine shared a private smile with Kieran as the older woman continued to exclaim over the romantic aspects of their story, conveniently overlooking any potentially scandalous implications of their time alone together. By evening, the entire town knew of their engagement and the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. The following 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparations and courting activities that, while compressed, gave their relationship the public blessing of community recognition. Kieran called for Katherine each morning, escorting her to the general store where she selected modest but appropriate items for her trousseau. They took meals together at the hotel restaurant, attended a community dance at the schoolhouse, and sat side by side at Sunday services. Throughout it all, Katherine found herself falling more deeply in love with Kieran Westley. Away from the isolation of their cabins, She discovered new facets of the man she was to marry: his quiet authority when dealing with merchants, his easy way with children who gravitated to him on the street, his unfailing courtesy to everyone regardless of their station. For his part, Kieran seemed equally enchanted with Katherine, his blue eyes following her movements with evident admiration, his hand seeking hers whenever propriety allowed. The connection between them, forged in the crisis of the flood and deepened during their days alone together, only strengthened in the light of public scrutiny. On the morning of their wedding day, Katherine woke early in her small room at the boarding house, a mixture of excitement and nerves fluttering in her stomach. Mrs. Holloway had insisted on helping with preparations, and soon arrived with several other ladies from town bearing flowers, ribbons, and a special surprise: a wedding cake baked by the hotel cook. "Every bride deserves a proper cake," Mrs. Holloway declared, her usual brusqueness softened by genuine affection. "And you, my dear, with all you've been through, deserve it more than most." Katherine was touched by the community's embrace of her wedding, especially given her relative isolation since her father's death. As the ladies helped her dress in her best gown, a simple blue muslin that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranged her hair with flowers, she reflected on how much her life had changed in such a short time. From the near tragedy of being caught in the rising river to the joy of this wedding day, it was as if the flood had washed away her old life and delivered her to a new one, filled with promise and companionship she'd never dared hope for. The small church was filled to capacity when Katherine arrived on the arm of Mr. Peterson, the general store owner who had volunteered to give her away in the absence of family. Sunlight streamed through the simple stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews and the expectant faces of the townsfolk. And at the altar, waiting beside Pastor Fleming, stood Kieran, tall and straight in a new shirt and his best trousers, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. The look on his face when he saw Katherine walking toward him was one she knew she would remember for the rest of her life, a mixture of awe, tenderness, and pure joy that reflected exactly what she felt in her own heart. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful, their vows spoken in clear, steady voices that carried to every corner of the small church. When Pastor Fleming pronounced them husband and wife, Kieran's kiss was brief but heartfelt, mindful of their audience yet conveying his love and commitment. The celebration afterward, held in the hotel dining room, was more exuberant than either had anticipated. It seemed the entire town had turned out to wish them well, bringing small gifts and sharing in the cake and punch provided by the hotel. "Seems the flood brought some good after all," observed Judge Wilson, raising a toast to the newlyweds. "Out of adversity comes the strongest bonds, they say, and I reckon that's true for the Westleys here." A cheer went up from the assembled guests, and Katherine found herself blushing as Kieran's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her close to his side. "Are you happy, Mrs. Westley?" he murmured for her ears alone. "More than I ever imagined possible," she replied, turning her face up to his with a smile. "And you, Mr. Westley?" "I have everything I could want right here," he answered, his blue eyes warm with promise, "and a lifetime ahead to enjoy it." As afternoon faded into evening, the couple finally took their leave amid good-natured teasing and heartfelt well wishes. Kieran had arranged for a wagon to transport them and their belongings back to Katherine's homestead, which they had decided would be their primary residence given the established garden and livestock. The journey home, and it was home now, Katherine reflected, in a way it hadn't been since her father's death, was filled with comfortable conversation and occasional companionable silences. As they crossed the area that had been so devastated by the flood, signs of recovery were already visible: new green growth pushing through the mud, birds returning to reclaim their territories, the land renewing itself as it had done countless times before. "Nature's resilient," Kieran observed, following her gaze. "Destructive sometimes, but always creating something new from what's been lost." "Like us," Katherine said softly, something new and beautiful arising from what could have been tragedy. Kieran's hand found hers on the wagon seat, his fingers warm and strong as they entwined with her own. Exactly like us. They reached the homestead as twilight painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Kieran helped Katherine down from the wagon, but instead of letting her walk to the cabin, he swept her into his arms with a grin. "I believe there's a tradition about thresholds that we should observe," he said, carrying her toward the door, "for luck and prosperity in our marriage." Katherine laughed, her arms circling his neck as he navigated the cabin door with exaggerated care. "And here I thought you weren't a superstitious man, Mr. Westley." "Not superstitious," Kieran corrected, setting her gently on her feet inside the cabin, which had been prepared for their return with fresh flowers and a fire laid ready to light. "Just unwilling to take chances with our future happiness." The simple statement, like so many Kieran made, went straight to Katherine's heart. She reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "I love you, Kieran Westley," she said, the words coming easily now that they had the right to express such feelings openly. "More than I thought possible in such a short time." Kieran turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. "And I love you, Katherine Westley. Have since I pulled you from that river, I think, though I was too stubborn to admit it even to myself at first." "The river rose too fast," Katherine murmured, remembering that terrifying moment when she thought she might be swept away. "But you were there. Always will be," Kieran promised, drawing her into his arms. "Wherever life takes us, whatever floods come our way, we'll face them together from now on." As their lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that the rising river, which had seemed like such a disaster at the time, had in fact been the greatest blessing of her life, delivering her not only from danger, but to the man who would be her partner, her love, her home. 1 year later, Katherine stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, watching as Kieran worked with the new colt in the corral they had built together. The homestead had flourished under their joint care, the garden now 3 times its original size, a second field cleared and planted with wheat. A small orchard of apple and cherry trees started along the southern slope. Inside, their daughter Emma slept peacefully in the cradle Kieran had carved during the long winter evenings, a perfect blend of her parents with Katherine's dark hair and Kieran's blue eyes. Born just 9 months after their wedding, she had been named for Kieran's mother and had her father wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment of her birth. Life wasn't always easy. The frontier ensured that challenges came regularly in the form of harsh weather, predators threatening their livestock, and the endless work required to wrest a living from the land. But facing those challenges together made them manageable in a way Katherine had never experienced during her lonely months after her father's death. As if sensing her thoughts, Kieran looked up from his work with the colt, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun as he spotted her on the porch. The smile that spread across his face, still capable of making her heart skip a beat after a year of marriage, spoke volumes about the strength of their bond. He secured the young horse and crossed to the porch, taking the steps 2 at a time to reach her side. "How are my girls?" he asked, brushing a quick kiss across her lips. "Emma's sleeping, finally," Katherine replied, leaning into his embrace, "and I'm enjoying the view of my handsome husband at work." Kieran chuckled, his arm tightening around her waist. "Careful, Mrs. Westley. Talk like that might lead to a sibling for Emma sooner rather than later." "Would that be so terrible?" Katherine asked with a smile. "A house full of children with your blue eyes and stubborn chin. Not terrible at all," Kieran agreed, his expression growing serious despite his light tone. "In fact, nothing would make me happier, but only if you're ready. This past year hasn't been easy on you." Katherine turned in his arms to face him fully. "This past year has been the happiest of my life," she said with complete sincerity. "Yes, there have been challenges. Yes, balancing motherhood with all the work of the homestead has been difficult at times. But Kieran, every day I wake up grateful for that flood, for the river that rose too fast and brought you into my life." Kieran's blue eyes warmed with emotion as he bent to kiss her properly, his hands gentle on her waist. "As am I, my love. As am I." From inside the cabin came the first stirrings of Emma waking from her nap, a soft coo that would soon become more insistent if ignored. Katherine smiled against Kieran's lips before reluctantly breaking the kiss. "Duty calls," she said, though there was nothing but love in her voice. "Go tend our daughter," Kieran replied, releasing her with a final quick kiss. "I'll finish with the colt and be in shortly to help with supper." As Katherine moved toward the door, Kieran's voice stopped her once more. "Katherine," she turned, one hand on the doorframe. "Yes," his expression was tender as he gazed at her, backlit by the afternoon sun. "I thank God every day for sending that flood, for putting you in my path, for giving me the chance to build this life with you." The simple statement, so characteristic of her husband's straightforward nature, brought tears to Katherine's eyes. "As do I, my love, as do I." With a final smile, she entered their home to tend to their daughter, her heart full with the knowledge that sometimes life's greatest perils can lead to its greatest joys, and that a river rising too fast had carried her not to disaster, but to the love and happiness she had never dared to dream might be hers.